Forever used to feel safe, like something that could never break. But what happens when the person who promised to stay becomes the one you might lose, or the one who's been loving you all along? This story isn't about perfect love. It's about messy truth, hidden feelings, and choosing honesty when it costs everything. If you believe love isn't always simple, but always worth understanding, hit like, subscribe, and stay with me till the end. Forever used to feel like something soft and harmless, a word stitched together from childhood promises and quiet laughter under blankets, sealed with pinky swears that made everything seem unbreakable. It carried the comfort of permanence, of never being left behind. Now it presses differently, no longer gentle, but heavy and uncertain, like a question that won't stop echoing beneath my skin. It was easy to believe in forever when everything was simple, when love didn't blur lines or ask for explanations. It becomes something else entirely when the person who has always stood closest starts looking at you like you're slipping away, even while you're still right there within reach. I have always known who I am. That truth settled into me at 16, quiet but undeniable, when my heart refused to follow the path everyone expected, and instead turned softly but surely toward girls. She has always said she is straight. She has never wavered on that. Yet something shifts every time I let myself care about someone new. Something sharp and unspoken, like I have crossed a boundary that was never drawn out loud. It leaves behind a tension I can feel but never quite name. I have always been easy to overlook, the kind of presence that fades into the background without much effort. I prefer it that way. My world lives in small details and quiet corners, in sketchbooks filled with strangers who never realize they've been turned into something permanent. I notice things most people miss, the subtle habits that betray nerves, the quiet release in someone's posture when they finally feel understood. I learned early how to carry myself through difficult moments without making noise about them, how to survive by minimizing the weight of what hurt. What I didn't understand back then was that the real complication had always been beside me, woven into my life so deeply it felt inseparable. She had been there since childhood, deciding without hesitation that I belonged to her world, choosing me again and again with a certainty I never questioned. Where I disappear, she commands attention without trying. She is brightness, effortless and magnetic, the kind of person people orbit without realizing it. And somehow out of everyone, she chose me. She has always chosen me loudly, protectively, as if I were something worth defending, worth keeping. When the world felt unkind or unfamiliar, she stood in front of me like a shield. When things at home grew heavy, she filled the silence until it felt livable again. She never hesitated to hold my hand in public, never cared who noticed, never softened the way she claimed me as hers in the language of friendship. Back then, it all felt normal. It felt like luck. It was easy to explain away every moment of closeness, every touch that lingered a little too long, every flicker of something deeper. It was simple to believe that affection could look like anything as long as it stayed within the boundaries she insisted were there. The pattern revealed itself slowly, almost gently, until it was impossible to ignore. Every time I found happiness with someone else, something in her would tighten. It never came out as open disapproval, never loud enough to confront directly. Just small fractures disguised as concern, subtle interruptions that pulled me back toward her. Conversations cut short, moments redirected, attention reclaimed. What I felt with others always seemed fragile, like something that needed quiet to grow, and yet it was constantly being interrupted by a pull I didn't know how to resist. And when those relationships ended, she was always there to gather the pieces, holding me close, reassuring me in ways that felt comforting but carried something else beneath the surface, something I refused to examine too closely. It became a cycle I convinced myself was coincidence, something harmless, something I was imagining. I told myself I was reading too much into it, that I was projecting meaning where there was none. I repeated the same quiet excuses until they sounded like truth. Then something shifted, subtle but undeniable. A moment stretched too long, a silence that felt heavier than it should have, an expression that didn't match the words being said. It cracked something open inside me, something I had carefully avoided naming. That was when it started to become clear that forever was never just about staying. It was about what happens when staying begins to feel like losing, when the idea of being replaced settles into someone's chest like something unbearable. It was about the quiet realization that not all love fits neatly into the boxes we try to place it in, and that sometimes the lines we depend on were never as solid as we believed. I said no, of course not. Chloe's straight. The words left my mouth easily, almost rehearsed, but they didn't settle the way they were supposed to. Ivy accepted them with a small nod, yet something unspoken lingered between us, a quiet tension that refused to dissolve. It hummed beneath the surface, subtle but persistent, and I found myself unable to silence it completely. Somewhere deeper inside, a softer voice had begun to form. It wasn't loud or confrontational, just observant, collecting details I had spent years ignoring. It noticed the way Chloe's expression shifted when Ivy laughed a little too freely at something I said, how her attention sharpened whenever my happiness didn't revolve around her. It tracked patterns I had dismissed for so long, how she always seemed to need me most when I was beginning to feel whole somewhere else, how she never truly let anyone else get close to her in return. I buried that voice as quickly as it surfaced. Letting it grow meant unraveling too much, meant questioning something that had been the foundation of my life for as long as I could remember. Some truths feel too heavy to face, not because they are unclear, but because of everything they might destroy once acknowledged. By the time Ivy started to pull away, the exhaustion had already settled into my bones. I felt stretched thin between two versions of my life, one rooted in history and loyalty, the other reaching towards something new and uncertain. To Chloe, it wasn't a complicated situation at all. It felt like something was being taken from her, something she believed had always belonged to her. I couldn't see it that clearly. I only knew that something was off, and pretending otherwise was becoming more painful than admitting it. Chloe wore the word straight, like something casual, something effortless. It slipped into conversations without weight, a label she could put on and take off depending on the moment. She would say it lightly, almost playfully, before doing something that blurred every boundary she claimed to stand behind. Sometimes she joked about me being the exception, brushing it off with laughter that made everyone else join in. I laughed too, even as something tightened quietly in my chest each time she stepped over that invisible line and then acted like it had never existed at all. That word became a shield for her, a way to keep the world from asking questions, and maybe a way to keep herself from having to answer any. But there are only so many times a line can be crossed before it stops feeling imaginary. The moment it became impossible to ignore came wrapped in noise and heat, and too many bodies pressed into one space. Ivy's hand rested in mine, her touch absent-minded and grounding in a way that made me feel chosen, steady. When Chloe arrived, she carried her usual presence with her, filling the room before she even fully stepped into it. But the instant her eyes landed on us, something flickered, quick and almost invisible, gone before anyone else could notice. She greeted Ivy politely, distant in a way that felt intentional, then slipped back into me like it was instinct, her arm finding my waist with a familiarity that felt harder to justify in that moment. Her voice was warm against my ear, her closeness sending a ripple through me that I didn't want to examine too closely. I created space, small but deliberate. She felt it immediately. As the night stretched on, she stayed closer than necessary, amplifying every interaction, every laugh, every glance. When Ivy stepped away for a moment, Chloe leaned in with a softness that didn't match the words she chose, suggesting lightly that Ivy's presence wasn't really needed. It was framed as a joke, but there was nothing playful in her eyes. I tried to pull the moment back into something normal, but the air had already shifted. When she reminded me she was straight, it didn't land like reassurance. It felt like something carefully wrapped to disguise the impact beneath it. After that, distance became something I started building quietly, without confrontation or explanation. I responded less quickly, declined more often, allowed myself to lean into something that felt right instead of something that felt inevitable. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough for her to notice. She always noticed. The change unsettled her in a way she couldn't fully hide. She framed it as concern, as confusion, as something Ivy was causing rather than something already there. She spoke about losing me as if I were slipping away, rather than simply growing into a life that included more than just her. Every word came layered, care on the surface, something sharper underneath. And when I pointed out the absence of anything real in her own romantic life, she brushed it aside with a casualness that didn't quite hold. A small admission slipped through before she covered it with laughter, but it lingered in my mind longer than she intended. The night she showed up unannounced, everything felt heavier. She sat in my space like she belonged there, but without the usual brightness, without the ease that had always defined her. Her words were quieter, more fragile, carrying a weight that settled deep inside me. She spoke about not wanting to be left behind, about something slipping out of reach. I wanted to explain that nothing was being abandoned. That change didn't have to mean loss, but the way she looked at me made those thoughts feel impossible to say out loud. Growth can feel like betrayal to someone who only understands staying. Inside me, the voice I had been avoiding finally sharpened into something clear. It named what I had spent years softening, replayed moments I had dismissed, lined them up in a way that made them impossible to ignore. The closeness, the possessiveness, the absence of anything real outside of me. It all settled into place with a quiet, undeniable clarity. I didn't want to define her, didn't want to force meaning onto something she hadn't claimed herself. But I couldn't keep pretending not to see it either. After that, everything between us grew heavier. Her moods shifted unpredictably, warmth turning into distance, affection into something edged with resentment. Ivy felt it too, even without understanding the full shape of it, becoming more careful, more guarded, as if bracing for something neither of us could stop. I found myself caught in something that drained more than it gave. What I felt with Ivy was steady and right, something that didn't ask me to shrink. What I felt with Chloe was tangled and inescapable, rooted in years that couldn't simply be undone. The line she had drawn so confidently for so long was beginning to blur, losing its shape with every moment we crossed it without acknowledgement. And beneath that slow unraveling was a quiet fear, because once something like that disappears completely, it doesn't return in the same form again. The night everything finally surfaced arrived without warning, wrapped in rain and silence. The sound against my windows felt steady, almost rhythmic, like a countdown I didn't yet understand. I had just stepped back into my apartment, still carrying the weight of an evening filled with things left unsaid, when her name lit up my phone. Before I could respond, she was already there, standing at my door, soaked through. Her composure washed away along with everything she usually hid behind. She didn't wait for permission, didn't pretend everything was fine. She stepped inside like she had nowhere else to go. She sat down as if something inside her had finally given out, the usual performance gone, replaced by a silence that felt unfamiliar and heavy. I stayed close but careful, aware in a way I had never been before, as if even the smallest movement might shift something irreversible. For the first time, she didn't look untouchable. She looked fragile, like something that had been holding itself together for too long and was finally beginning to crack. When she spoke, her voice carried none of the certainty I had always known. It was stripped down to something raw, something honest in a way that felt impossible to ignore. The words came out unevenly, breaking through whatever walls she had built over the years, revealing something that had been waiting beneath all along. She unraveled everything she had been holding in, piece by piece, like a truth that had waited too long to be spoken. Every relationship I stepped into had felt, to her, like a ticking clock counting down to the moment she would lose me. Calling herself straight had been easier than facing what lived underneath, easier than naming something that didn't fit the life she had built for herself. She told herself she only wanted me to be happy, clung to that idea until happiness began to exist somewhere she couldn't follow. When she finally admitted she couldn't stand the thought of me choosing someone else, her voice gave out completely, stripped of all the certainty she usually carried. The words settled into the room and stayed there, heavy and undeniable. The rain outside filled the silence, steady and relentless, like it was echoing everything neither of us could soften anymore. Inside me, something froze and then shifted all at once. Years of moments I had dismissed rearranged themselves with startling clarity, every detail falling into place, as if it had always been waiting for this exact realization. Relief and fear collided in a way that left me unsteady, caught between the urge to comfort her and the instinct to step back before everything I knew was rewritten beyond recognition. I sat there with my heart racing, thoughts tangled between her and Ivy, between what had just been revealed and what it meant for everything else in my life. Honesty had arrived, but it hadn't come gently, and it hadn't come without consequences. When I admitted I didn't know what to say, it felt like the only truth I could offer. She didn't ask for more. She didn't expect anything in return. She only needed the weight of it to exist outside of her, to stop pretending it wasn't real. That word, pretending, cut deeper than anything else. It exposed how long we had both been avoiding the truth, how much of our connection had been built on things left unsaid. I had been explaining her behavior away, softening it into something harmless. She had been hiding behind a version of herself that kept everything manageable. And now that illusion had cracked under the pressure of reality. I didn't close the distance between us, but I didn't create more either. I stayed where I was, suspended in that fragile space, listening as she spoke about confusion that had stretched on for years, about trying to force herself into something that never felt right, about how loving me had always existed somewhere between inevitability and impossibility. What I felt in response wasn't simple or clean. It wasn't a sudden clarity of romantic feeling, but something deeper and more complicated, an ache rooted in empathy, in understanding how easily love can exist without fitting into the shape it's supposed to take. Caring for someone doesn't always mean knowing how to love them in the way they need. When her words finally ran out and exhaustion replaced them, I helped her settle, small gestures filling the silence where conversation had been. She wrapped herself in something that carried traces of me, and I saw the way it softened her expression. Something intimate but not quite romantic, something that lived in the space between. She apologized for the complications, for the disruption, for everything that had shifted because she had finally told the truth. I didn't try to fix it with words that would only oversimplify what had happened. Some things don't need explanations, just acknowledgement. She fell asleep not long after, worn down by everything she had been carrying. The quiet that followed felt different, heavier but also clearer, like something fundamental had changed shape and wouldn't return to what it had been. Lying awake, I let that truth settle fully. What she felt for me was not contained within the boundaries she had always insisted on. It was something deeper, something she had tried to ignore until it became impossible. And now that it had been spoken, there was no returning to ignorance, no slipping back into the comfort of not knowing. Morning arrived too softly for the weight it carried. Light filtered in as if nothing had changed, as if the night before hadn't altered everything beneath the surface. She was still there, curled into herself, smaller somehow, like the confession had stripped away part of what made her seem untouchable. Watching her, I felt everything at once: care, guilt, fear, a tenderness that didn't have a clear place to land. But beneath it all, one thought remained steady. Continuing to pretend would only deepen the damage. I left her to rest and turned toward the reality waiting for me elsewhere. Messages I had avoided sat there, quiet reminders of something I could no longer hold together halfway. She deserved honesty too, deserved something whole instead of something divided. Letting go of that relationship felt slow and deliberate, like setting something fragile down with the knowledge that it might still break. There was no anger, no accusations. Just a quiet understanding that something had shifted beyond repair. The calm that had once felt so right now carried the weight of everything I hadn't been able to give fully. When it ended, it wasn't explosive. It was gentle, almost careful, which somehow made it hurt more. Walking away left me with a mix of grief and relief that didn't feel entirely fair. When she woke, the space between us carried everything that had changed overnight. I told her what had happened, not as a sacrifice or a gesture, but as a consequence of truth finally being faced. Her reaction wasn't relief. It was guilt, immediate and genuine, and that made it harder in a different way. Dintinians don't erase outcomes. That truth sat between us just as heavily as everything else. We didn't rush into anything new. There was no sudden shift from one form of love into another. Instead, we chose something harder, honesty without shortcuts. No more blurred lines, no more leaning on old habits to avoid discomfort. Just clarity. Even when it felt unnatural, conversations stretched long and raw, peeling back layers we had ignored for years. She admitted she didn't even fully understand herself yet, that the identity she had relied on no longer felt solid. I listened without trying to shape it into something easier, reminding myself that uncertainty doesn't need to be solved immediately. The days that followed carried a different kind of closeness. It wasn't loud or overwhelming, but intentional. She gave space where she used to cling, asked instead of assuming, held back in ways that felt unfamiliar but meaningful. That restraint created a new kind of intimacy, one built on awareness instead of instinct. And in that space, I felt something unexpected. Missing her even when she was right there, even when everything was being handled carefully. It wasn't something I could define yet, and I didn't force it into a label. Some feelings need time to exist without being named. We found our way into quieter routines, conversations that stretched into reflection instead of assumption, moments that acknowledged how much had changed and how uncertain everything ahead looked. Fear was still there, but it was shared now, spoken instead of hidden. She admitted she was afraid of losing me entirely if the safety of what we had disappeared. I admitted I was afraid of choosing familiarity over truth. Saying those things out loud shifted something between us, made it less about holding on and more about understanding what we were becoming. One evening, under a sky that felt softer than everything we had been through, she spoke without trying to secure anything, without asking for guarantees. She simply offered herself as she was, uncertain but honest. That simplicity carried more weight than anything she had said before. What we were building didn't feel like what we had before. It was quieter, more fragile, but also more real. Honesty didn't fix everything, didn't untangle every emotion or erase what had already been lost, but it stopped the constant strain of pretending. For the first time in a long while, something steadier began to take shape. Not certainty, not a perfect resolution, just the quiet understanding that whatever came next would exist without illusion. When things finally began to shift into something new, it didn't arrive with intensity or grand declarations. It started carefully, with hesitation and awareness, with the understanding that whatever we tried would need patience. It wasn't about claiming each other anymore. It was about seeing if something real could grow where truth had finally been allowed to exist. So mattered more. The agreement settled between us with a quiet kind of gravity, and when I nodded, the calm that followed surprised me. It wasn't forced or fragile. It felt real. Somewhere inside, a careful kind of hope stirred awake, not rushing forward, just watching, curious about what this could become. This wasn't the version of love we had unknowingly rehearsed for years. This was unfamiliar territory, something we had to build slowly, learning it piece by piece like a language we had never spoken before. The beginning of us was almost painfully simple. A walk through a park, ice cream melting faster than we could eat it, nothing cinematic or overwhelming. She showed up differently, softer, less guarded, as if she had set down the version of herself that used to perform so effortlessly. She asked questions and stayed present for the answers, really listening instead of filling the silence. When she reached for my hand, she paused first, leaving space for me to decide. That pause shifted something deep inside me. It made me realize how much had changed. Before, she would have closed the distance without thinking, turning everything into something playful and certain. Now, she offered instead of taking, and when I accepted, the connection felt mutual, chosen, something that existed because we both stepped into it. It wasn't effortless. Knowing each other so well came with its own complications. Familiarity made things easier, but it also carried the weight of old habits waiting to resurface. We recognized each other's patterns too quickly, the small tells, the moments we used to avoid. Sometimes we slipped back without meaning to. A flicker of jealousy would appear where it didn't belong. I would retreat inward, instinctively protecting the independence I had fought to build. But instead of ignoring it, we stopped. We named it. Giving those moments a name stripped them of their power, kept them from quietly shaping everything beneath the surface. We rebuilt boundaries slowly, awkwardly at times, like learning balance after growing into a body that no longer moved the same way. She stopped assuming access to every part of my life. I stopped carrying the responsibility of managing her emotions. We talked about things we had never dared to define before, about attraction, confusion, identity. She admitted how disorienting it felt to realize that desire didn't follow rules, that it couldn't be explained away with simple labels. There was fear in her, fear of disappointing expectations, of stepping outside the version of herself people understood. And when I told her that fear didn't diminish her, that it simply made her human, it felt like something inside both of us finally softened. Joy appeared in quiet, unexpected ways. We burned dinner and laughed until it didn't matter. She watched me create, not as someone standing nearby, but as someone who genuinely wanted to understand. I watched her learn how to exist in stillness without hiding behind humor, how to sit with discomfort instead of deflecting it. Falling into this didn't feel like losing control. It felt like building something stable, something that could actually hold the weight of who we were becoming. One night, in the dim quiet of my living room, she admitted she had started therapy. She said it casually, but the tremor in her hands told the truth beneath it. She wanted to grow, not just for us but for herself. That moment stayed with me. It reframed everything. Love wasn't showing up as intensity or grand gestures. It was showing up as effort, as accountability, as the willingness to face the parts of yourself that were easier to ignore. I checked in with myself constantly, questioning what this meant, what I was choosing and why. Whether it was comfort pulling me back toward her, or something deeper, something that existed because I wanted it to. The answer didn't arrive dramatically. It settled slowly, steady and certain. Being with her no longer felt like shrinking into something familiar. It felt like expanding into something honest. Even the way we touched changed. There was less urgency, more attention. She learned to recognize my silences, to understand what they meant without forcing me to explain. I learned the rhythm of her unease, the subtle ways it surfaced when she felt uncertain. Intimacy stopped being something performed and became something shared, something shaped through conversation rather than assumption. Some nights we didn't need closeness to feel connected. Talking was enough. There were still echoes of the past, thoughts that surfaced unexpectedly, reminders of what had come before, of endings that had never fully resolved. But instead of unsettling me, they grounded me. They reminded me why honesty mattered, why I refused to build anything on half-truths again. When I finally recognized what I was feeling, it didn't feel overwhelming or inevitable. It felt deserved. It felt like something we had worked toward, something shaped by effort instead of assumption. It wasn't the love we once imagined in simpler years. It was something more fitting, something aligned with who we had become. We never made a formal declaration, never sat down and defined what we were in clear terms. And somehow, that absence of labels felt right. There was no need for announcements or certainty pressed too early. Understanding grew quietly between us, settling in naturally, like light filling a room without asking permission. She started introducing me differently, without the old possessiveness, without the need to define me through her, just my name, spoken with intention. The first time I noticed, something inside me loosened, a tension I hadn't realized I was still carrying. Love didn't need to be loud, it needed space. Our lives filled with small, ordinary moments that carried more meaning than anything dramatic ever could. Arguments over trivial things, long drives with no destination, laughter that came easily and stayed. The past didn't disappear, but it stopped controlling us. It became something we could look back on without feeling trapped inside it. She continued figuring herself out, moving through certainty and doubt without rushing the process. I stayed, not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to. Because staying felt like a decision I made again and again. There were moments when old instincts tried to resurface, when fear or habit nudged at the edges of what we were building. But instead of letting them take over, I acknowledged them and let them pass. Growth didn't mean those feelings vanished. It meant they no longer dictated what came next. She noticed those moments too, grounding them with quiet reassurance that didn't feel forced. It wasn't about pretending everything was perfect. It was about recognizing that what we had was real, even in its imperfections. Running into the past one day felt less like a disruption and more like a quiet confirmation. There was no bitterness left behind, no unresolved tension, just the understanding that things had ended the way they needed to. Walking away from that moment, I felt lighter, grateful for what had been learned instead of weighed down by what had been lost. Over time, the idea of forever softened. It stopped feeling like something that had to be promised or guaranteed. It became something flexible, something that could exist without pressure. Something chosen, not demanded. She once admitted that she used to hold on tightly out of fear, that she believed keeping me close meant not losing me. Now, she understood something different. Wanting someone didn't mean needing to contain them. The way she said it carried a quiet confidence that felt more meaningful than anything she had ever expressed before. Looking at myself, I could see the difference too. I wasn't the same person who allowed others to shape her boundaries without question. I had learned to walk away when something stopped being right, to choose honesty even when it was difficult. Loving her didn't erase that independence, it strengthened it. Life felt fuller, lighter in ways that were hard to describe. I created more, rested better, existed without constantly measuring myself against expectations. Love, when it was done right, didn't make me smaller. It gave me room to grow. The future became something we could talk about without needing to control it. Possibilities instead of plans, curiosity instead of pressure. There was comfort in not knowing exactly what would come next, in trusting that whatever happened, we would face it honestly. One quiet moment captured everything we had become. She rested against me, no tension in her voice, no fear hiding beneath her words. She didn't need to hold on tightly anymore to feel secure, and in that simplicity I saw how far we had come, Forever no longer felt like something to fear, not because it was guaranteed, but because it no longer depended on illusion. If it continued, it would be because we chose it, not because we were afraid to let go. And if it didn't, it would end without bitterness, without regret poisoning what we had shared. Now, when she looks at me, there's no trace of the uncertainty that once lived there. No jealousy, no unspoken tension. Just presence. Just the quiet, steady certainty of choice.